They surrounded it. They sealed the borders. They choked the trade routes. They froze the money. They did everything right. And Burkina Faso didn't just survive. It built something. Something that is now threatening to permanently break Western financial control over an entire continent. One landlocked nation. No ocean. No allies, or so they thought. And yet, right now, iron convoys are moving through the Sahel under drone cover. Customs revenue is flowing back into African hands. And a railway is being planned that could redraw the economic map of West Africa forever. So how exactly does a blockade become a blueprint? Stay with me. Sometime in the last 2 years, someone in a comfortable office in Paris, Brussels, or Washington made a calculation. The calculation was simple. Burkina Faso is landlocked. Cut its access to the coast, freeze its corridors, pressure its neighbors, and the government in Ouagadougou will have no choice. It will bend. It will negotiate. It will come back to the table on terms that the international community, which is a polite phrase for a specific set of powerful interests, can accept. The calculation was logical. It was historically supported. And it was completely wrong. Because Ibrahim Traoré did not bend. He built. And what he built, quietly, methodically, with a speed that defied the assumptions of every analyst who had written Burkina Faso off as a failing state stumbling toward economic collapse, is now forcing a fundamental rethink of how power, trade, and sovereignty actually function in 21st century West Africa. The iron snake moves through the Sahel today, carrying not just goods, but a message. And that message is being read very carefully in capitals far beyond Ouagadougou. Let's establish what we're actually dealing with here, because the geography matters enormously, and it is impossible to understand this story without it. Burkina Faso has no coastline. It never has. Sitting at the dead center of West Africa, it is surrounded by 6 nations in every direction, none of which share its specific political trajectory, and several of which have found themselves, willingly or under pressure, aligned against it. For generations of Burkinabe governments, this was simply the permanent condition of economic life. You needed the coast, you needed the ports, you needed the goodwill, or at minimum the commercial cooperation of your coastal neighbors. There was no workaround. There was no alternative architecture. The sea was the sea. And between Burkina Faso and the sea stood countries that held veto power over your economy, whether they exercised it explicitly or not. That structural dependency shaped everything. It shaped trade policy, it shaped diplomatic calculations, it shaped the quiet compromises that every Burkinabe government made when external pressure arrived. Because every government knew that the pressure had teeth, that the teeth were made of geography, and that geography could not be argued with. Traoré decided to argue with it anyway. The first signal that something fundamentally different was happening came not from any dramatic announcement, but from a shift in trade flow data. As the traditional corridors through Côte d'Ivoire and Benin became increasingly complicated politically, logistically, and commercially, the volume of goods moving through Togo's Port of Lomé northward toward Burkina Faso began to climb. This was not accidental. It was the visible surface of a deliberate strategic decision made inside Ouagadougou, that the blockade's disruption of old routes was not a crisis to be managed, but an opportunity to be seized. If the old architecture was going to be weaponized against Burkina Faso, then Burkina Faso would build a new architecture entirely. Togo was the pivot, and the choice of Togo reveals the sophistication of the strategic thinking behind this entire project. President Faure Gnassingbé had spent years cultivating Lomé's position as one of West Africa's premier port cities, deep harbor, modern container facilities, competitive handling rates, genuine ambition to become the region's logistics gateway. Togo had also maintained a foreign policy posture notably independent from the consensus positions being pushed on Burkina Faso. Lomé was open. Lomé was pragmatic. And the Port of Lomé sat at the southern end of a corridor that, with investment and political will, could run all the way to Ouagadougou. The distance from Lomé to Ouagadougou is roughly 1,000 kilometers by road. That is not a short journey. through West African terrain, across border crossings, along roads that range from adequate to punishing. Moving commercial freight volumes over that distance had always been expensive, slow, and vulnerable to the kind of informal taxation, roadblocks, unofficial fees, documentation delays, that inflates transport costs and depresses trade volumes across the entire region. The old Abidjan corridor had worked not because it was ideal, but because it was established, familiar, and supported by decades of commercial infrastructure. Replacing it required solving problems that were simultaneously logistical, institutional, financial, and political. What happened next is where this story gets genuinely remarkable. The electronically sealed transit system was the first major innovation deployed along the new corridor. Understanding why this matters requires a brief detour into how transit trade actually works and how it typically fails in West Africa. When goods move from a coastal port through one or more transit countries to reach a landlocked final destination, they travel under a transit declaration. The goods are theoretically sealed, their movement tracked, their arrival at the final destination confirmed before customs duties are formally assessed. In practice, across much of the region, this system has historically been porous. Seals were physical and could be replaced. Documentation was paper-based and could be manipulated. Goods disappeared between port and destination. Customs revenue leaked into informal networks at every checkpoint. The transit system that was supposed to protect the fiscal interests of landlocked importing nations was, in reality, a mechanism through which significant value was extracted from those nations by everyone along the route. The electronic sealing system deployed on the Lomé-Ouagadougou corridor attacked this problem directly. Containers leaving Lomé were fitted with tamper-evident electronic seals, GPS-enabled, digitally logged, continuously monitored. Any interference with a sealed container triggered an immediate alert in both Togolese and Burkinabe customs systems. The chain of custody was no longer dependent on paper documents that could be altered or officials who could be persuaded. It was digital, real-time, and verifiable. The practical effect was a sharp reduction in cargo diversion and a corresponding increase in the proportion of goods that arrived at Burkinabe customs facilities intact and accounted for. This is where the fiscal dimension of the strategy begins to come into focus. Every ton of goods that previously leaked out of the transit system between Lomé and Ouagadougou represented customs revenue that Burkina Faso never collected. Multiply that across the full volume of the country's import trade over years, and the cumulative fiscal impact is significant. The electronic transit system did not just improve logistics. It redirected money, real, substantial amounts of customs revenue, back into Burkina Faso's state treasury, at a moment when the government was under financial pressure from multiple directions. This was not a minor administrative improvement. It was a meaningful contribution to fiscal resilience. Ask yourself this. When the architects of the sanctions and border closures designed their pressure campaign, did they account for the possibility that the pressure itself would force innovations that made the target government more fiscally self-sufficient? Almost certainly not. That is the kind of second-order consequence that strategic planning tends to miss. The dry ports took this logic further. An inland clearance depot, a dry port, moves the entire customs clearance apparatus away from the coastal port and into the landlocked nation's own territory. Instead of goods being processed, assessed, and cleared in Lomé before traveling inland under temporary transit status, goods arriving under the new corridor arrangement are processed, assessed, and cleared in Ouagadougou itself. The customs authority, the warehousing, the documentation, the revenue collection, all of it happens inside Burkina Faso, under Burkinabe jurisdiction, generating employment for Burkinabe workers and fees for the Burkinabe state. The long-term significance of this institutional shift is hard to overstate. Coastal ports have historically captured an enormous proportion of the economic value generated by West African trade, not just port fees and handling charges, but the entire ecosystem of customs brokers, logistics companies, warehousing operators, freight forwarders, and financial service providers that cluster around major port facilities. That economic ecosystem has for generations been located on the coast, generating wealth and employment in coastal cities, while landlocked interiors remain structurally dependent. the dry port model begins, slowly, incrementally, but genuinely, to shift some of that value inland. It is not a complete solution. It does not eliminate the fundamental advantage that coastal geography provides, but it changes the distribution of economic activity in ways that accumulate over time. The iron snake is the element of this story that captures the imagination most readily, and it is worth examining carefully because it represents the intersection of security and commerce that defines the Sahel's specific challenge. The name itself, the iron snake, conjures something deliberate, something that moves through hostile terrain with purpose and protection. The militarized convoy system that earned this name operates on a straightforward principle. Commercial freight moving along the Lomé-Ouagadougou corridor travels under armed military escort, supported by drone surveillance over the most vulnerable sections of the route, with response capacity embedded in the convoy structure itself, rather than dependent on external intervention. The security environment that made this necessary is the same environment that has defined the Sahel crisis for the better part of a decade. Armed groups operating across Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have demonstrated consistent ability to intercept commercial vehicles, extort transport operators, and effectively tax informal trade flows passing through territory they influence or control. The cost of this insecurity to regional commerce has been enormous, not just in direct losses from robbery and extortion, but in the risk premium that transport operators and insurance providers attach to any cargo movement through the region. High risk means high cost. High cost means reduced trade volume. Reduced trade volume means less economic activity, less employment, less state revenue. The Iron Snake's militarized model was designed to break this cycle by making the security guarantee explicit and operational rather than aspirational. The results, by available accounts, have been meaningful. Reported security incidents along the corridor declined after the convoy system was fully operational. Transport operators, who had been pricing the route as prohibitively risky, began to recalculate. Freight volumes increased, and as volumes increased, the per-unit cost of moving goods along the corridor fell. The basic economics of logistics infrastructure playing out in real time, with the security guarantee functioning as the enabling condition for everything else. What happens next on the security front is genuinely uncertain. The armed groups operating in the Sahel are adaptive. The drone surveillance and military escort model that works today may face new tactics tomorrow. The sustainability of the Iron Snake as a commercial lifeline depends on a security situation that remains fluid and contested. But the model itself, the explicit militarization of critical commercial infrastructure as a state security priority, represents a significant conceptual departure from how logistics and security have traditionally been siloed in West African governance. The railway proposal sits at the far end of this infrastructure vision, and it is worth spending time with because it reveals the full ambition of what is being attempted. A rail link from Ouagadougou to the Port of Lomé would not simply replicate the road corridor in a more efficient form. It would fundamentally transform the economics of Burkina Faso's trade in ways that roads cannot achieve. Rail freight costs per ton-kilometer are a fraction of road freight costs. Rail can move bulk commodities, minerals, agricultural products, construction materials at volumes that make road transport economically unviable. Rail is far more resistant to the informal taxation and roadblock extortion that plague road transport across the region. And rail infrastructure, once built, creates a physical and economic fact on the ground that is extraordinarily difficult to reverse. Consider what a functioning Lomé-Ouagadougou railway would mean for the alliance of Sahel states over a generation. Burkina Faso's known mineral wealth, manganese, gold, zinc, phosphate, could move to global markets at competitive cost. Agricultural products from the Sahel's farming regions could reach coastal consumers and export terminals more efficiently. The cost of manufactured goods and industrial inputs moving inland would fall, stimulating economic activity across the entire corridor. Ouagadougou would not merely be an administrative capital, but a genuine commercial hub at the center of a regional logistics network. The economic geography of West Africa would look materially different. This is precisely why the railway proposal generates such sharp reactions from the external actors most invested in maintaining the current order. A landlocked nation that controls its own rail access to the sea is a fundamentally different strategic proposition from one that depends on the goodwill of coastal neighbors. The leverage that geography has historically provided to those who would pressure Burkina Faso diminishes substantially if the railway gets built. And the diminishment is permanent, not dependent on political relationships that can shift, not vulnerable to the closure of a border crossing, not subject to renegotiation every time diplomatic temperatures change. The connection between this infrastructure project and the broader challenge to CFA franc system dynamics deserves direct engagement, because it is frequently either overstated or dismissed entirely. The CFA franc arrangements, the specific mechanisms by which Francophone West African currencies have been pegged to the euro and managed through agreements with France, are genuinely complex, and the economic literature on their effects contains serious disagreement. What is not seriously disputed is that the political salience of the CFA question in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger is enormous. The perception that monetary sovereignty has been constrained by an arrangement designed to serve external interests rather than domestic development needs is deeply embedded in the political culture of the alliance of Sahel states, regardless of what economists argue about the technical merits of the peg. What the Lomé corridor, the dry ports, and the iron snake have to do with this is indirect but real. The coastal trade corridors that have historically funneled Burkina Faso's import and export trade were embedded in a broader economic architecture that included CFA franc banking systems, French commercial interests in major port cities, and financial service networks that reinforced the structural dependencies the currency arrangement created. Disrupting the trade corridor is not the same as exiting the CFA franc zone, but building alternative economic infrastructure that routes value through different channels, captures more revenue domestically, and reduces dependence on the commercial ecosystems concentrated in CFA zone coastal cities, is, cumulatively, a step toward the kind of structural economic sovereignty that the political conversation about the CFA franc is ultimately about. Whether Traoré and his government will move toward formal monetary reform, whether the alliance of Sahel states will take the dramatic step of establishing a common currency independent of the CFA framework, remains genuinely uncertain. The technical challenges of doing so are substantial, and the risks of a poorly managed currency transition could easily outweigh the political benefits. But the infrastructure being built now is consistent with a longer-term trajectory in that direction. And the international financial actors who understand this are watching the Lomé corridor with attention that goes well beyond logistics. The alliance of Sahel states itself is the final dimension of this story that demands serious examination. When Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger formalized their alliance, critics were quick to characterize it as primarily a security arrangement among three embattled governments seeking mutual reinforcement against both internal insurgencies and external pressure. That characterization was partially accurate, but it missed the economic logic that was simultaneously being constructed. The Lomé corridor does not just serve Burkina Faso. It serves a potential network of transit trade that could extend into Mali and Niger. The dry port infrastructure being developed in Ouagadougou has a natural extension as a regional distribution hub serving all three alliance members. The electronic transit systems and customs modernization programs being piloted on the Togo corridor could become the template for a common trade facilitation framework across the alliance. If that vision is realized, if the alliance of Sahel states develops genuine economic infrastructure that supports intra-alliance trade and provides shared logistics connectivity to global markets, it becomes something qualitatively different from a security pact among besieged governments. It becomes the nucleus of an alternative regional economic order, one built on explicitly different principles from the frameworks that ECOWAS and the CFA zone represent. That is not a certain outcome. It is not even a probable near-term outcome given the security situation, the governance challenges, and the resource constraints all three countries face. But it is a possible trajectory, and the infrastructure investments being made today are the first tangible steps along it. Here is the question that should genuinely occupy anyone thinking seriously about West Africa's next decade. Not whether Ibrahim Traoré survives politically. That is a question for another documentary. But whether the infrastructure outlasts the politics. Transformations embedded in physical reality are harder to reverse than political declarations. If the Lomé corridor becomes the established route through which Burkina Faso's import economy primarily operates, if the dry ports develop genuine commercial depth and the logistics networks that depend on them develop genuine stake in their continuation, if the electronic transit systems become the standard through which regional customs authorities interact, then the strategic shift endures beyond any individual government. The sanctions architects understood that geography was their weapon. What they did not fully account for was that geography is also a problem that can be engineered around. Not cheaply, not quickly, not without serious risk and continued hardship for the Burkinabe people, who are bearing real costs in this confrontation. But the engineering is happening. The iron snake moves. The dry ports process. The customs revenue flows differently than it did 3 years ago. And somewhere along the route between Lomé and Ouagadougou, the map of West African economic power is being quietly, irreversibly redrawn. They tried to use a landlocked nation's geography against it. They may have accidentally taught it how to make geography irrelevant. And that lesson, once learned, does not stay inside Burkina Faso's borders. Here it is, a standalone 300-word ending, built to hit hard and leave the viewer thinking. They thought the landlocked nation would kneel. They thought geography was destiny. They thought cutting the corridors, sealing the borders, and freezing the trade routes would be enough to bring Ouagadougou back in line, back into the familiar architecture of dependency that has governed Francophone West Africa since the ink dried on independence papers that, in practice, changed very little. They were wrong, because what Ibrahim Traoré built in response to the blockade is not just a logistics corridor. It is a proof of concept. It is living evidence that a landlocked Sahel nation, with no ocean, limited capital, and active insurgency inside its own borders, can still redesign its economic relationship with the world when it decides the old design no longer serves it. The iron snake moves. The dry ports process. The customs revenue flows home. And the railway, still a blueprint today, represents the final argument that permanent, structural access to the sea does not have to be negotiated. It can be built. The deeper danger, from the perspective of those invested in the current order, is not Burkina Faso alone. It is the template, because Mali is watching, Niger is watching, and beyond the alliance of Sahel states, every landlocked, resource-rich, economically constrained African government is watching what happens when a country decides that geography is an engineering problem, not a permanent sentence. The blockade was designed to be a ceiling. Traoré is trying to make it a floor, the lowest point from which everything else is built upward. Whether he succeeds completely is uncertain. Whether the infrastructure outlasts the politics is uncertain. But one thing is no longer uncertain at all. The map of West Africa is moving, and no border closure stopped it.